Welcome back to The Other Side of Change, only on the Black Star Network. So much is going wrong in our country today, but we're here to reimagine what is going right and how we can get to the other side. This is a show that moves beyond the world as we know it to the world as it should and could be. I'm Jamira Burley, and I'm here with my amazing co-host, Brea Baker, and we are just two millennial women tackling everything at the intersection of politics, gender, and pop culture. Today, we're going to dig into a big question, right? A big question is, should we aim for reform or abolishing the entire system together?
Yeah, and this is not a new conversation. 5 years ago, abolition took the mainstream following the murders of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and countless others. And as two women who've worked on change from different angles, we've got plenty to say and a pretty amazing guest joining us later to dig in some more.
Yeah, and I love the fact that we're both rocking our green today. So, you know,
it feels very abolition focused. Like green is newness, is like a new plant blooming. So
of course you would say that you own a farm, so that makes sense. Okay, you're trying to indoctrinate.
Also that.
Understandable. I mean, at this point, with the cost of eggs, I might have to get some chicken.
And the recalls, child. You gonna need to grow your own food.
Dangerous times. But before we get into the big topic of the day, let's talk about what is the craziest headlines we've seen so far. Because every single time I open my phone, I want to close it. I want to throw it. I want to just close out the world. But if you do close out the world, you'll miss like 20 stories. So what is one of the craziest headlines you've seen so far this week?
Well, I mean, Trump is laying everybody off, and he was offering federal workers, he offered federal workers a buyout of 8 months' pay in an effort to shrink government, which is insane. Like, y'all cannot even keep the government afloat, and you got 8 months' pay for people who ain't going to be working? Mm-hmm. Make sense. The math is not mathing.
I mean, I think it's a prime example. There's a number of things that are happening, right? Like Trump thinks that he can come in and slash employees and say that, oh, we've saved the government money, totally negating the fact that these are individuals that are in very important positions that are there to provide checks and balances for the different areas of the government. And for me, I think what is happening is that they're trying to get rid of witnesses as we watch the biggest heist of federal dollars in the history of the United States. Because with folks like billionaires surrounding his cabinet, just salivating at the opportunity to take money from this department and pat their own pockets, we're looking at a bank heist in broad daylight, and it's kind of scary.
Yeah, that is a really great and scary way of putting it. Not needing witnesses. Oh my gosh. Well, speaking of that, I mean, there's some other crazy headlines though this week.
I mean, who needs witnesses if the president is just going to pardon you anyway, right? So one thing I found really interesting that Trump did within hours of being elected, instead of him looking for ways to unify the country, bring folks together, talk about his vision for America that ideally would include the vast majority of us or all of us in general, he decided to pardon the rioters, the criminals from January 6th who tried to overthrow the government at the behest of President Donald Trump, who was running for president in 2020. He decided to pardon all of them. More than 1,000 individuals who not only stormed the Capitol on January 6th, they injured police officers, they destroyed property, they broke into government offices. And apparently senators are running around saying that this was a normal day at the Capitol. I've been to the Capitol many of times. And
you ain't never seen that?
Girl, they are checking my bags. They are throwing out my water. They're asking me to open my laptop to make sure that it's working and that I'm not carrying around some sort of device to destroy property. So the idea that these folks were able to come in there with weapons and push through security guards, and Trump is now saying, oh, I'm just going to pardon them all. Free speech, girl, bye. I mean, and now we know that one of the individuals that he pardons was just unalived by police because he wanted to push back against being arrested. During an arrest, he was shot and killed by police just days after being pardoned. And we're probably going to see numerous stories like that over the next few months.
What's interesting is this moment keeps reminding me of the tension, to go back to abolition, between this is a party and Trump's administration claims to be very pro law enforcement and yet is like unleashing these like crazies out into the world who have no respect for any sorts of authority, who don't want, who see their pardon as a get out of jail free card, because that's what it was. And then they effing around and finding out. And it's like, okay, so now where do y'all stand on police brutality now? You gonna, okay, got you.
I mean, if you notice, even the police have been quiet. What happened to All Lives and Blue Lives Matter, right? It just goes to show you that it was never really about that, right? It was always about quenching the outcry of what we saw, what was happening, which was police unaliving unarmed black and brown folks and not being held accountable. And now when you see a president comes in and says that police are a part of people that he cares about, letting folks go who actually killed and injured police officers on his watch, it's all a rouge. It's none of it is real, right? At this point, like they make up their own rules every single day that better suits their ideology, which tells us that doesn't include people that look like us.
Yeah, literally shifting the goalposts nonstop. And speaking of shifted goalposts, it's also been wild to see all these companies that in 2020, they had the black squares up. They said, we are committed to DEI, Black Lives Matter here. And they are walking back those DEI commitments. They were talking a good game in 2020, talking about pipelines to leadership and putting black retailers on the shelves and black businesses and nearly 5 years out, we couldn't even wait till a decade, 5 years out, the next administration over from the racial reckoning, Trump is in office. And it seems that people have seen that as like, great, I can actually say goodbye to that. I can take the mask off, be who I really am. And it just feels like it's hurt the movement in so many ways. I mean, even beyond these DEI rollbacks in California took some big hits with ballot measures when it came to policing and prisons and public safety. And it was scary to be like, wait, if Californians are voting in some of the most carceral legislation we've seen in recent years, what does that mean for the rest of the country? So it just feels like while some people are calling for reform and bipartisanship, there's others of us in much smaller force than it was 5 years ago saying it's time to tear it all down. And you've been inside some of these rooms. So what's the vibe?
Unfortunately, I've been inside some of those rooms. And, as someone who's worked in government, nonprofit, corporate tech, I knew it was BS from the get-go. I knew it was BS because the fact that you had to publicly state that you stood for inclusivity and equity, as if these are some grand transformative statements in a country that is so diverse and has always been diverse, I think always was the writing was always on the wall. Yeah. And I think that seeing so many companies that I've consulted for, that I've spoken on their stages as have you, right, at many of these conferences, these social impact conferences, to seeing some of them make these horrendous steps back in the wrong direction, to your point, tells us that they were never fully invested. They never believed in that this was truly a part of their values structure. And also, I think it's a little short-sighted, right? Because if I have anything to do with it, Trump is not going to be president for 4 years, after 4 years. If I have anything to do with it, the Republicans will not be in power in 4 years. And so for companies that know that millennials and Gen Zers and Gen Alphas, our memory is not that short. Okay, we are going to remember where companies stood in moments of crisis and how they bowed to the dictatorship and the tyranny of the Trump administration, a man who has been in office less than 30 days. And so it's pretty hilarious. But also white women, white people, and veterans benefited the most from DEI policies.
The most.
Let's be honest, when people say DEI, they really just mean Black, not knowing what it actually encompassed. I mean, DEI protected veteran rights. DEI protected folks with disabilities. DEI enabled for women to take off leave while they were pregnant or sick. Like, there's so many things that are encompassed in DEI that has nothing to do with the hiring practices. And also, let's be serious. Black women are some of the most educated women educated people in the United States. Okay. We don't need to be begging anyone for a job. When we show up, we do the work above and beyond of what is expected of us. And we always are overqualified for the roles we get hired for. This is not a DEI that's for us. This is a DEI for y'all, because y'all could never measure up. I mean, many of you could never measure up, I should say.
No, it's okay. You could say the first part. Y'all can never measure up. I'm the anger translator for Jamira. She's going to say things very kindly.
I appreciate you.
I'm saying none of y'all deserve the spots you've been getting. But I think that's real. And I think it's like, they're not DEI hires, they're white supremacy hires. I was just talking to someone, Dr. Alvin Tillery, about this. And he's like, no, DEI was developed to reset an unbalanced scale. And so those who are saying, oh, we need to dismantle it are like, oh, actually, I could only compete when it was unfair, when I had this unfair advantage. And to me, it's like, not for nothing, but if I knew I could only get the job when like millions of Americans were barred from even having access to the opportunity to it, that would keep me up at night. Like I'm nowhere near as good as I think I am.
As you and your wife have the diplomas on the wall, okay? You're more than
both of them being my wives. I mean, we'll say that. But yeah, it's like, I mean, Yale grads and the amount of people who firmly believed that any Black person walking that campus was only there because of affirmative action is like, well, only because before affirmative action was segregation and then Jim Crow South and then slavery. So yeah, if you weren't treating my ancestors like property, I might have had a better window in. But unfortunately, Yale was literally built on my ancestors' backs. So I had to wait until we could reset that. And now you're dismantling it. It's actually wild because then you have people who are sort of looking at this moment like, oh yeah, Trump is, rolling back Biden's. And it's like, no, Trump is rolling back LBJ's work. Mm-hmm. Trump is rolling back JFK's work. Trump is rolling back 14th Amendment clauses. Like this man is really committed to undoing centuries worth of like the bare minimum, really, because it's also, we should have had more. There should have been more protections. There should have been more things codified. And the fact that the bare minimum protections we do have are being rolled back is very alarming.
Yeah. And it brings to mind the results of this election and why people voted for Donald Trump in the first place, right? Yeah. Is because they knew they could not compete without creating things so inhospitable to minority communities to the extent that we either left or we just took it, right? And one of the things that many people forget is that, minorities can't win any national election without the support of white people. Like that's just the reality. Like if you break down the numbers, and we know that Democrats have not received the majority of white votes since the 1965. What happened in 1965? What legislation was passed in 1965?
The Rights Act, yeah.
The Civil Rights Act of 1965, which goes to show you that white people inherently, or many white people inherently believe that they cannot compete. And they are frustrated by institutions that look to create an equal opportunity for anyone who calls this country their country, that they should not be facing institutional barriers, cultural barriers that prevents them from reaching their full potential. That doesn't make our country, that doesn't make our society safer or more prosperous. But also the numbers don't lie. One of the things I always used to say in my keynotes when I talk to corporate leaders or in my workshops is that, DEI, social impact, is not the nice thing to do. It is actually, it benefits your bottom line. It actually makes your business stronger. It brings more money in the door. So now you see companies cutting off their nose to spite their faces to a politician who actually doesn't give a damn about their bottom line.
Right. Which is why working with them and trying to reform those institutions is really only ever legitimizing them. And we know that they're intentionally broken. They're not getting it right, not because they didn't take enough classes, not because they needed a really well-designed social media graphic to show them. The people on the right, these conservatives, are intentionally misunderstanding us because it doesn't serve their long-term goals. And we have more political power than we ever have, but we're still afraid to shake the table. And by we, I don't actually mean you and me, but we have people in power who are not using their power. And those who are standing on business are getting pushed out by AIPAC and other moneyed political groups. So it's just very alarming and shows like we are up against a lot, which is why trying to rebuild it is only ever going to evolve it. So I feel like we should just look at some of how mainstream media is talking about this topic because we know they're getting it wrong.
Oh, of course. I mean, they're always getting it wrong. One of the articles that came out by New Republic talked about the Minneapolis Police Department is dismantling itself, right? Yes. And like, we know what... I can't even. I'm so frustrated as someone who used to work in police accountability, how we see like so many police forces around the country. And let's be real, there's like 15,000 police forces across the country. Right. Many of them are breaking the law by using excessive use of forces. So seeing Minneapolis Police Department dismantling itself, particularly dismantling the DEI and the commitments that they made since the George Floyd, the Breonna Taylor unalivings by police, just goes to show you again, the investment is, if there's not the federal pressure on these departments to do right, they will not do right. They will always go back to doing the status quo, which is treating people who look like us vastly different than our white counterparts.
Yeah, 1,000,000%. And I read that article and it was so wild because what they were saying was that the police force, like staff wise, has shrunk, I think, a third since 2020 because police officers don't want to be police officers, which is like, okay, wait, abolitionist baddies? Are y'all trying to dismantle it too? But then at the same time as there are less people on staff, the police budget in Minneapolis has grown since 2020. Mm-hmm. So it's just really scary. And we need to be very vigilant of like, just because less people are trying to work in these jobs does not mean that the institution of policing is actually going away. They are still very well resourced. They are still better funded than most of the social programs that would actually prevent the sort of like violence and harm and crime that we're talking about. But they're just feigning as if they have the harder job when it's like, well, you're the ones with the weapons and the bulletproof vests going and marching through the communities in damn near tanks. And we're the ones with the knees on our necks and the chokeholds and the bullets in our backs. So who should actually be scared? I think that's the alarming thing. But
they want impunity, right? That's why they're not showing up. That's why they want impunity. But we're going to take a break. We'll come back and continue to discuss some of these hot headlines and remix them a little bit because we know these news institutions are doing many of it wrong. But we'll be back on the other side of change after this break.
Hello, I'm Isaac Hayes III, founder and CEO of Fanbase. And right now we're accepting investors in our $17 million round to revolutionize the future of social media. Today, for just $399, you can own 60 shares of stock in Fanbase at $6.65 a share. Go to startengine.com/fanbase and invest today. While the big platforms have grown too massive and disconnected from their users, Fanbase is building a platform where creators and users truly come first. We've already raised $8.6 million from everyday investors who believe in this vision, and now you can join them. This is your chance to invest in a social media tech company with over 1 million users that is disrupting media by allowing anyone to reach all of their following and monetize their content from day one. The market is changing, big platforms are failing to serve their users, and Fanbase is stepping up to fill the gap. Don't wait until it's too late. Invest now. Invest for yourself and your future. Go to startengine.com/fanbase and own the future of social media.
We are back with the other side of change only on the Black Star Network. Let's remix some final headlines. Before the break, we were talking about what media is getting wrong when they talk about abolition, Minneapolis Police Department, and just how much resources are going into policing and prisons. And I actually wanted to talk about some other headlines that I've been seeing, specifically since Trump's election. Him and his cronies are using the word abolition a lot, which is very ironic considering they were fear-mongering around it during 2020. But Trump has called for the abolition of FEMA, which now in the aftermath, or we're still in the midst of the wildfire situation, feels really insane. And Mike Lee was calling for the abolition of TSA. What is going on with these conservatives using terms that they were previously telling us was incendiary to be using?
I mean, this is a prime example that the conservatives do an amazing job. I will not deny this. They do an amazing job of co-opting our words, co-opting our language for their own uses and nefarious uses, right? And the difference between us talking about abolition and us talking about, dismantling institutions that have traditionally done us harm is that what they're doing is what I mentioned earlier. They're trying to get rid of witnesses. They're trying to repurpose federal dollars to either privatize institutions that should be governmental run and pad the pockets of their billionaire cronies, or what they're trying to do is get rid of witnesses as they commit crimes themselves institutionally. There's no TSA has not always been a staple institution within the United States government, right? It has not. It came about after the 9/11 attacks. And there's a lot of attack. I have my own issues with TSA. We have our beef, right? All the time. I fly a lot.
You got beef? That's your op?
Well, maybe I shouldn't say that because I don't want them come looking for me and pat me down more. But I have my beef with TSA because I got clear, I got pre-check, I got global entry. And for some reason, my Black self always gets pulled aside for the secondary check. Now I'm like, what's on the record? What y'all got on me? But I have my own beef with them, but they have stopped a number of nefarious actions from occurring. And so what we're seeing oftentimes with the president and the Republican conservative nation, as they continue to call for the abolishment of traditional institutions within our government, is that they are seeking to privatize these institutions for the benefit of their colleagues on the outside, and, to feed the billionaire class and to continue to transfer wealth from our government into the pockets of billionaires. And we should all be very vigilant as we hear conversations like this, because we also he's feeding on our frustration with these institutions, not recognizing that they do serve a purpose, even if we dislike off the 90%. We dislike a lot of what the institution does, especially as it impacts us.
And like you said, when he's saying abolish these institutions, it's about privatization. So it'd be one thing if it was like, we've actually found there to be a lot of Islamophobia and anti-Blackness in the way that TSA carries out their work. And so we are going to curb those behaviors, or we're going to dismantle some of that impunity that they have to do the work that they do the way that they do it. But that's not what they're saying. And so what is actually going to happen is when it's in the hand of a private company, there's even less oversight over what they're doing and how they're doing it. And we're just going to have to subject ourselves to what exactly? No, I'm not.
Private companies accountable for violence it inflicts on the public. That's something to also important to talk about. Like, if you even look at everything that happened with NASA, right? There's a chunk of money that went to Elon Musk during these, these handouts, because that's what they are. They're government handouts to Elon Musk company, Starlink, I think it's called.
Yeah.
And we don't know what that money is being used for. We don't know what is happening with that. Our federal dollars being used for this private company. And that is going to happen across the board if FEMA and the TSA and other institutions that Trump is trying to abolish and become private, or even like the U.S. Postal Service, right? He was calling for it to abolish that. The man is crazy.
We're not going to be able to afford anything. But we've seen what privatization does with private prisons, and we don't want that. It goes back to disaster capitalism, this idea of trying to profit off of something that, if you're just trying to keep people safe, why are you trying to spin a profit? If you're just trying to keep people safe, why?
Or make it efficient, you don't increase the prices.
Right, exactly. But they're co-opting our language, especially after they were condemning us for using that language to critique the government, which is very interesting. It's like Trump and his administration are very much straddling this line of being very pro-police and pro-prisons, but also being proud of of having a felony, and very proud to it's this weird dance he's trying to do. And it just really proves that it's never actually been about the word choice or the messaging. They just want to balloon funding for the things that they care about, which are police, prisons, and military, while stripping everything else down, which will lead to more of the fear and the chaos and the crime.
Yeah, and it's a reminder that they deliberately co-opt progressive language to muddle the waters, right? It puts us on the defense of having to defend institutions that we know are inherently harmful to us, right? Because we see that there is some benefit of it, and we also know that the intentionality about why he wants to do these things are not for the benefit of us or for the benefit of the larger American population. So we have to be very cautious and ask why, right? If this is about efficiency, if this is about reform, like why and who truly benefits in the long run? Because I guarantee you, it's not you.
Yeah, 1,000,000%. Can somebody tell Snoop and Nelly and Soulja Boy and all of them that? Because they are cozying up to the administration.
They're not like us. They're not like us. Sadly enough, even though they're going to be treated like us, they're not.
1,000,000%. Yeah, 1 million. And it's just very performative. It's just everything that we're seeing right now is this I'm going to say what feels good in the moment, even though I'm not backing it up with anything real. We saw JD Vance do that a lot in the debates, saying things that's actually not the platform of your party. And that's not what, you're trying to bring people onto your side by saying the juicy, exciting thing in this moment, when The lie detector has determined that it's not what you're actually going to do when it comes down to it. And so, yeah, to go back to what we were saying before, like these companies do not care about us.
No, the companies do not care about us. The government does not care about us. That is why it is going to be the responsibility of the community to, wrap our arms around each other during these difficult times, to, provide resources, mutual aid for us to stand in front of each other when we know that there are going to be institutions trying to, marginalize us, to create this division, to target those who are the most vulnerable within our society. That's when we have to step up, not just when it impacts us, but when it impacts those around us, because they'll start coming for them, and eventually they'll start knocking on your door, and by then it will be too late. So you can't turn away. You can't look away and think that it's those folks over there, because eventually it'll be you too.
Yeah, 1,000,000%. But I've been loving though I don't want to give the conservatives too much power, because yes, we have a very uphill climb with Republicans controlling all three branches of the federal government. But there's so much that people are and can do locally to just keep this movement going. And I think it's just been beautiful to realize like abolition is on the tips of the tongues of more people than ever before. College kids are doing teach-ins, talking about participatory budgets and defunding violent agencies.
There's now a Black university called Hillman Top.
Yes.
About racism and Spanish and like financial literacy. To your point, people are stepping up.
Yeah, filling in those gaps. And like to filling in the gaps, there's also been a number of new like unarmed responder like local initiatives that are basically saying like you don't need to call 911 for everything. And we need to have a more decentralized way of addressing harm. If it's just a traffic stop, we do not need someone with a gun addressing that. If it is a domestic violence, like if it is a disabled, like we need more of people having specialized training for the sorts of crime or the sorts of situations that they're responding to. And so it's been really beautiful to see these sort of non-police response teams, these violence interrupters, which again, you've been doing police accountability work for a while. So this is not new. We've seen people like Erica Ford at Life Camp, GMAC, and a lot of Chicago-based groups that have been doing this work, right?
There's a lot of organizations that have been working for the cities and the states that actually want to do real work and actually do reform. They're taking those active steps of partnering with community organizations all across the country to really think about how do we create better relationships between the police or institutions of power with the community. How do we give more power back to the community to do their own sort of accountability and analysis on what issues do result in calling the police versus community response, because you have so much knowledge, a wealth of knowledge and resources already within community. And if we're creating a space where people can share that information ahead of time, whether it's mental health, whether it's housing, whether it's food, we can actually prevent police coming in and taking over our communities and making it more safe. Because the data doesn't lie. I like to say that all the time. The data doesn't lie. And if only politicians made decisions on good data, our entire world would look vastly different. And the data tells us that more police presence actually make our communities worse. It actually perpetuates and escalate violence. So we don't see when violence happens in the suburbs, they don't put more police. We don't see when school shootings predominantly happen at white high schools. We don't see them put metal detectors and barbs and bar wires on the windows, right? But we see that in Black and brown communities all the time. And it doesn't make us safer. If anything, it perpetuates this idea of the school to prison pipeline. It perpetuates this idea of the school to deportation, right? Making people feel like criminals, and therefore they might start acting like them.
Yeah, 1,000,000%. And I think that's what frustrates me about, and you brought this up earlier, the reactive space that conservatives keep us on when we are responding to their talking points, because they don't care about safety. Like that's not at all what they're invested in, because we saw what police did in Uvalde. Nothing. Yeah. We see what police do when women are being raped and sexually assaulted. Nothing. They're actually more like
the president of the United States. The president of the United States literally committed to sexual assault.
Yeah, they're not committed to any of our safety. And so what's frustrating is to have abolitionists be painted as those who are kind of like surrendering our communities to the wolves, when it's like, no, we're actually just getting more creative about things that actually keep us safe. And those things have historically not needed to be these militarized police forces, but is like the person who owns the bodega, who knows everyone in the community by name and can say, hey, you're here without your mom and you acting up and I don't need to call police. I'm gonna call your mother, right? Like that's community safety. Or the faith leader who is actually able to house and feed people and keep them from acts of desperation and crimes of convenience or survival, right? Like, but we're defunding the very people and agencies and actually criminalizing the people and agencies that want to do that sort of work just so that they can fill the beds, because there is profit to be made in that. So it just, the more we spin our wheels, the more upsetting it gets. But I'm excited because we have a really great guest to talk to. So let's go into a break and then talk to Camonghne when we come back.
Awesome.
What's up, y'all? Look, Fanbase is more than a platform. It's a movement to empower creators, offering a unique opportunity for everyday people to invest in Black-owned tech, infrastructure, and help shape the future of social media. Investing in technology is essential for creating long-term wealth and influence in the digital age. The Black community must not only consume tech, we must own it.
Discover how equity crowdfunding can serve as a powerful tool for funding Black businesses, allowing entrepreneurs to raise capital directly through their community through the Jobs Act.
We are back at the other side of change, only on Black Star Network. And we are all about dreaming beyond limits and putting our finger on the better world that we're actually working towards. And I am so hyped because today we have my boo, Camonghne Felix, here with us. Camonghne is a brilliant writer and organizer who diagnoses what's wrong with the now and lets us know how much possibility lies in abolition. Her existing book, Dyscalculia, is a favorite of mine. And she has a forthcoming book that we're going to let her tell us all about later. Welcome to the other side of change, Camonghne.
Hi, thank you for having me. You're both so brilliant. I can't wait to listen to this podcast.
Oh my God, you, boo, you. We love you. Okay, so Camonghne, let's start with just like a little dreaming, because I feel like we have lost our ability to dream outside of the lines, and people can kind of only operate between what they've already seen and like slight tweaks to that, which is again what we're not about. So when you dream of this abolitionist world, paint the picture for what most excites you about how more people will be able to access safety, dignity, and joy.
You know, I think it actually starts with a scenario that you just brought up, right? That you go to the grocery store or you go to the corner store and there's a young person who clearly needs some kind of service, right? Whether they're acting up or they're in crisis, right? And that person, whoever is like running the grocery store, knows who the mom of this child is and knows exactly who to call, when to call them so that this child can be taken care of, right? That is such a radical image because it offers a suggestion that we already know to be true, which is that we have what it takes to take care of each other and to take care of ourselves. And I also think that part of what the dream looks like is being able to redirect some of those funds that we know go to the carceral system into the world that we live in and the world that we want to live in, right? So I want to see schoolhouses that have new books. I want to see unhoused people being offered housing that is sufficient and humanizing. I want people to be able to go to the store and access food that is good for them, that is nurturing and fortifying. Those are some images that come to mind, and some of them feel a little abstract, but I think like that's what's so cool about dreaming, right? Is that in some ways, like you have to dream in an abstract way to even get close to imagining something that's concrete, right?
Thank you for sharing that. That's one of the reasons why I follow you online. But I'm reminded of, prior to meeting you, and for those who don't know, Camonghne also used to do electoral politics. I'm sure she still dabbles in it a little bit. But we met during her time on the Elizabeth Warren campaign. But I was following you prior to that online and had seen some of your performances. And one of the things that I always thought stood out is your ability to verbalize, like really contextualize this idea of imagination, and that I feel like so much of that has been stolen from us here in the United States of what is possible, like dreaming beyond the traditional limits that society has placed on our minds, right? And our ability to think about something different outside of what we told is possible. And so I'm curious for you, because COVID radicalized me. I'm curious, what was that moment for you that radicalized you, that got you to the point of believing that this new world is possible?
That's a great question. It's hard to identify one moment, because I think that my radicalization is a composite, right? Like, it came from so many different moments and so many different times. But I have one essay that I wrote for New York Magazine about abolition. And it came from a place of really wishing that my experience with sexual harm was treated differently, right? That the person who caused me harm, that their punishment wasn't to also receive harm. And I think as I started to try to understand, like, what was that anxiety that I was feeling, right? Like, why did I feel so bad that this person who harmed me had to go to prison? And so in trying to navigate that, I started reading, like Ruth Wilson Gilmore and Cedric Robinson, just really trying to contextualize, like, what is the thing that makes it so hard to reconcile what's happening in our carceral system, right? So I think that's one of the things. But I also say, and Jamira, I know you can relate to a lot of this, like, being in electoral politics, like, every election cycle, I find myself angrier and angrier and more disillusioned, right? And the thing about disillusionment is that it can become useful or it can become despair, right? Which I don't think is always useful. And so every cycle, the more disappointed I got, the more enraged I felt and the more activated I felt. So in some ways, like, all the work that I've been lucky to do has led me to this point of radicalization. But yeah, I mean, there's so much more I could talk about. I started talking about Palestine with my dad when I was 12. And all of those experiences, just really makes up who I am today and the way that I think about power and progress in systems.
Yeah.
Oh, I love that you said that. And that reminds me of the Miriam Kaba quote, let this moment radicalize you rather than lead you to despair. And it's so real. I think it's easy to be, it's only angry, but you don't really get creative from a place of anger, right? Like, anger is good for fueling you towards participating in mass action or mobilization, but there's only so far it will get you, and it'll actually burn you out fast. And I remember being in that place after Eric Garner and Mike Brown and Sandra Bland were killed, right around like that 2014, 2015 moment. And it was like, I needed to tap into something that made me believe there was another world we could work towards, which is the beautiful thing about abolition. I love that people like Ruth Wilson Gilmore and Angela Davis and Derica Purnell can leave you thinking, like, wait, it doesn't have to be that way. Like, we funnel billions of dollars into this very violent killing machine. What if we didn't, right? Like, so where do you see the abolitionist movement now, whether that be from a comm standpoint and how much people understand it, or like the actual status of implementation?
So I think that the abolition movement is happening, it's sort of existing on all of those planes. It's happening in different ways at the same time. One of the most important things that's happening within the landscape right now is this consciousness raising effort, right? We don't get people to a place of imagination unless we invite them to imagination. And part of how consciousness raising works is bringing people into the space where they're willing to question why things aren't working, and in that space of questioning are able to receive some answers, not just about why it isn't working, but what might actually work in place of it. And I think, like, with credit to, of course, Derek Purnell, and so many and like we said before, Ruth Wilson Gilmore and Orasami Burton, right? We have so many people who are bringing this thinking into the mainstream consciousness. And I think, like, even though to some people that might feel really lofty and, again, abstract, like, there's so much work to be done in just communicating to people, not just what abolition is, but like why it matters to their everyday lives. Yeah. Like, people don't imagine that the carceral system exists in their homes, right? Mm-hmm. They think that it is something that lives only.
They're not ready for that.
Well, they're not ready for that. I know, but like, that's part of where we're at, right? Like, that's part of where the landscape is now. It's like having those conversations and being like, yeah, you probably didn't think about that, but that thinking has been done already, right? And I also think that abolition is absolutely at the point of implementation, right? I think one of the things, there's an organization called RAP, which is Releasing Aging Prisoners. And they just did an amazing action in Albany a couple of weeks ago. And I learned about them through some organizing work that I do with an organization called WAWAG, which is Writers Against the War on Gaza. And in this room, you have people who are concerned with, geopolitical oppression, and people who are concerned with local oppression, of course. And at the intersection is this organization where there are people who participated in the Attica riots, people who have been just doing prison reform and abolition work for a really, really, really long time. And the work that they're doing is not just to change what we think about incarceration, but really working to like get people out of jail, right? Get people out of jail, get people to get the systems, invalidate the system, so that the work of getting people out of jail is not about empathy, right? Or decisions that the state makes. It's about like our ability to advocate for ourselves and for our people, and to actually be able to build tools that create leverage that get our people out, right? So yeah, I think it's like abolition right now is doing a lot of different things, but I think consciousness raising and implementation through direct action and protest is where we are right now.
No, I'm happy you mentioned the consciousness piece, because oftentimes when we think of revolution or abolishment, it's the external, right? What is happening with us? But it first happens in our mind. Like, how do we decouple the lies we've been told about ourselves, about the world, about people who look like us, about people who don't look like us? I remember the guy who, there's a really great video going around on TikTok of the person who said, the revolution will not be televised because the first revolution will happen is a revolution of the mind, is reconstructing what is happening in our mind and how that has perpetuated our lack of imagination. We're coming up on the 250th anniversary of this country, and we know that on average, most empires last about 250 years. If there's ever been a time to reimagine, it is this moment when the country is going through this level of transition.
Absolutely. The empire is for sure falling. And it's during these moments of like extreme crisis that people feel like they have to think differently, right? Yeah. Like, when your life and the lives of the people that you love, when everything feels so precarious, you either give up or you imagine what it could be. And it's been very exciting to watch people come to abolition, even though for some people it's like really far off, and that's totally okay. But watching people move from, a place where they say like, well, we need prisons, how are we gonna stop crime, to a place where they're like, oh, we're not even sure if crime is like real, right? Like, just asking those questions, which like seem really complicated, but actually like allow us to have conversations that we just otherwise wouldn't have had. Like, it never occurred to me to like think about how the idea of a crime is constructed. Like, who came up with the idea of crime? What does it mean to commit a crime? Who gets to judge what is a crime or isn't, right? Like, we talk about, like, you know, crimes of despair, right? Where someone is perhaps like, or crimes of convenience, where someone's like deeply in need, and they might have to, I don't know, rob a store or rob a corporation in order to get what they need, right? How is it possible that being under-resourced and needing the resource to save your own life, right? How is it possible that in the process of trying to get that resource, that the only thing we can consider is that this person is bad, has done something wrong, and needs to be removed or isolated from their communities because they're hungry, right?
So it doesn't solve the original problem, right? It only perpetuates.
Exactly, right? So even just that question of like, what is a crime gets us so much further in our thinking about how our everyday lives work, right? Like,
yeah. I love that you're saying this. It reminds me, there is this Netflix documentary, or like, it's like a dramatized version of a true life story. And it was like one of the first psychologists that was suggesting that police departments do this. And he was doing it from a form of preventing crime and saying, like, if we have an archetype of the kind of person who wants to commit harm against another person, we can better prevent the harm. For example, if you know that a child who harms animals will grow up to be an adult who harms people, you can address that in a child early on and prevent the harm that happens against a person. But then the FBI kind of twisted that and used it as a way to catch people after the fact. And these psychological profiles of like a killer, but there's no preventative measure. And it just goes to the fact that our criminal legal system is built for revenge and not for actually preventing any crime. Most of the money that we put in is for catching someone after they've already did anything. We have no investment energetically or financially in understanding why people do what they do, why hurt people hurt other people, and why it's important to disrupt the cycle as early on as possible. And so we just churn out people who are just better at getting away with the harm, who watch the true crime shows thinking, oh yes, I just have to wear gloves next time. Like, it's like we are not invested in figuring it out. And that's because people are afraid to empathize. Last one I'll offer is, like, I was listening to a podcast that was kind of talking about someone who was trying to prevent like pedophilic harm. And was saying that like people were just so afraid to be looked at as empathizing with a pedophile that they didn't even want to be a part of the initiative. When actually, if you care about children, you should want to prevent the harm, even if that means having to talk to someone who's done it before and understanding why and how we avoid it. And it's so backwards that we focus more of our attention on getting people after they've done it and setting up the registries, and not enough on.
You know why, right? Because if you dig deep enough, if you dig deep enough, you'll realize that at some level, the government is at fault, right? There's something, there was a service, there was a situation, there was an environment in which, at its core, reason why people commit crime is because something was lacking in their life or their community that did not enable for them to grow up to be there, to reach their full potential in a way that was helpful to the community. Like uneducated kids, if you live in a community where there's rampant poverty and violence, and you go to a school that is not teaching you, the likelihood of you then going to either become incarcerated or commit a violent crime is pretty high, right? All because at the core of it, you were not provided what you needed to in order to be an active, productive, and participatory citizen within this country.
But that's also what's so interesting about abolition too, right? Is because abolition is asking us to like look at what harm is, and not just to look at what harm is, but to like look at all the ways that we are all complicit in systems of harm, right? Harm causing is systemic, right? Like, even when it's happening in your immediate community, there's some kind of system that's either responsible or is directly impacting the way that you're able to respond to harm, right? When we talk about abolition, we're not just talking about this like huge macro thing that like only relates to prisons, right? We're also talking about how we relate to each other in our own communities, right? Like if you believe in abolition or you're living in a world where you're trying to understand and commit to abolition, then when you see someone cause harm, right, even if it's emotional harm, your first impulse, right, may not necessarily, after learning about abolition, be then to like excommunicate this person. Obviously, there are some situations where like people might need to be distanced, right? Like for general safety, right? Especially when it's interpersonal violence. But at the same time, the idea that a person needs to be completely removed from the communities and sort of social networks that humanize them, like you start to think differently about whether or not that makes sense, right? And it's part of what I love about abolition is that we're asking people to think about how carceral systems are reproduced in their everyday lives and how we reproduce those systems too.
Yeah. I will say that has been the best part about abolition for me. It's been such an unfurling because you realize that like, okay, it's not enough to just point out and say, I don't want there to be police, but like, if I still want people to be safe, but I talk to people crazy. I have road rage. I'm instigating situations that might require mediation. It's made me so much more careful with my words. Like be intentional, Brea. Don't just be, well, I said what I said. Like, no, I have to care about how what I say lands for other people and not be casual about stepping on people's triggers. I have to care about where I spend my money and whether those companies are aligned with me. And I have to care about whether I'm the kind of community member that my neighbor could call on if something was happening that they don't need 911. Because the amount of people who call 911 for a noise complaint because they saw something suspicious, like call your neighbor.
It's crazy.
It's because they don't know their neighbors, right?
Yeah,
We've got actually in the divisiveness of individualism that we forget that the person down the street is our neighbor. Like we should be able to go not just borrow a cup of sugar, but actually say, hey, yo, my kid is trying to sleep. Can you turn down the music a little bit? But I'm going to stop us right there because we need to take a quick break. But I want to continue this conversation. So we will be right back on the other side of change.
Black Star Network is here.
Oh, no punch!
I'm real revolutionary right now.
Thank you for being the voice of Black America.
All momentum we have now, we have to keep this going.
The video looks phenomenal.
See, there's a difference between Black Star Network and Black-owned media and something like CNN.
You can't be Black-owned media and be scared.
It's time to be smart.
Bring your eyeballs home. You dig?
You are now back on the other side of change, only seen on the Black Star Network. We are back here with our guest and my co-host. And we were talking about like the division that we're seeing in communities. And I know, Camonghne, you wanted to, tap into that conversation. So I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, I always think it's so interesting when we start talking about individualism because we're implicitly and in some ways explicitly talking about capitalism, right? Yep. And I have this like perfect example. I live in a condo community and we have an HOA and the people who own the home above us they rent the apartment out. They do short-term rentals. So Airbnb, VRBO, et cetera, right? And when we first came to the condo and first came onto the HOA, we were like, hey, like, we're really not comfortable with that. Like, for many reasons, one of the obvious reasons being that like we live in a community of Black and brown people who aren't able to own homes. And so maybe we shouldn't be taking away more housing just for the purpose of spinning the block and making some money, right? So that said, there was an issue over the weekend where they had some guests who were extremely loud, kind of disruptive and destructive. They were obviously young people. They were kids having a party, right? Simple stuff. So we asked them to, check in with the guests and make sure that, they're not destroying anything, but also that like everything's okay, right? And we, first of all, it took forever to get in touch with them. And then when we finally did, we look out the window and the cops are outside.
Of course.
And our first impulse, my wife and I were just like, what? Who who called the fucking cops? Like, why would you call the cops? Like, this is your home. Your second home or whatever else is around the corner. We're here. We're telling you that we're more than interested in going upstairs and talking to these young people. But before that is even offered to us, you call the police, right? Mm-hmm. And the reality is that choice wouldn't have been made if that home wasn't a site for profit, right? Mm-hmm. If they actually lived in that home and cherished that home and cherished their communities, right? Then their relationship to policing would ultimately be different. It wouldn't have felt appropriate to, at 11 p.m., call the cops on a bunch of kids who are having a party when you know that the police could show up and do some real harm to them, right? Yeah. So when I think about community and abolition and how many different things the conversation of abolition touches, right? We're not, again, just talking about prisons. We're not just talking about police. We're talking about modes of relationality and the ways that we exist with and for each other, right? And what I'm hoping that abolition does is that it continues to break down those conflicts of relationality where we're able to actually tap in and think to ourselves, what do I actually want from my neighbor? Or I'm having a conflict. How do I actually resolve this in a way that keeps us all safe, right? And is resolution based, not just about ending things so that we can continue making our money or continue business as usual, right? So anyway, that was just, I wanted to.
No, I'm glad you shared that story because it shows that sometimes even when we want a non-carceral response, the society around us is only built to be like, oh, you need something? Let me call 911.
Correct.
And it's wait a second. I actually just wanted a conversation and why are we so, it's actually, not to broaden this conversation too much, but it's why I'm so afraid of where automation and AI is going, because we have less and less opportunities to talk to each other and realize wait a second, this other person is a human with the same desires and motivations and fears as me. I don't need to mobilize a police force against them when what I need is to have a respectful and leveled conversation with that person. But it's just alarming to realize that, again, we don't have that imagination. We have been conditioned to depend on police and we outsource all of our needs to them. So last question for you, Camonghne, but what I love is that your writing is something that kind of helps people to unfurl and unravel themselves and to realize that their needs may be different than what they thought they were, and their desires and their passions might also be different. I know you have a new project coming up that is going to have us thinking very differently about governance and how we depend on others to tell us what is okay. So tell us more about this project and anything else that folks can stay connected to you on.
Yeah, this project, Let the Poets Govern, it's ultimately about trying to identify the way that harm is reproduced and the way that not just harm, but white supremacy, subjugation of marginalized people, the way that has been reproduced through language, especially in our policies and in our governance at large, showing how that language gets reproduced and then the sort of poetics of that language, right? And when I say poetics, I mean almost easy to imagine, the way that the idea of what is beautiful or what is poetic, the way that we define how all of that stuff looks and what it looks like, right? So if we're talking about, policies, when we're reading that language, we understand it to be formal language, but we also understand it to be poetic, right? And so then what is the responsibility of that language if it is poetic language inherently? So it's a little complicated and again, in some ways abstract, but it all comes down to this question and conversation about abolition, right? How can we understand what it looks like to free our communities from the carceral state if we don't understand the kind of language that has shaped that state? So that's what Let the Poets Govern is trying to do. And it doesn't come out until next March. So I have plenty of time to figure out how to talk about this book. But I'm really excited to be able to contribute to the conversation in a way that is not prescriptive. I don't want people to come away from that book and be like, Camonghne told me what to do, and now I'm going to do it. I want people to come away from it and be like, oh, I'm thinking about this thing in a different way. And so now my understanding of what I can do, of what is possible, is now more expansive. And that's tough. I think like writing any kind of book that is polemic or is trying to respond to the world as is, right? Like people want answers. They want to be told what to do. And to resist that, I think, is like both radical and terrifying. So that's what I'm trying to do.
I love that so much.
Will get us there, though. Being a little terrified oftentimes will get us closer to where we need to be.
Yeah, I'm a little terrified. So hopefully.
And also you're in good company because all of the greats have also been in this place of, I'm not going to give you the answer. Number one, there is no one answer. I was just reading an Octavia Butler essay where she said that. There's no magic bullet. There are thousands of answers at least, and you can be one of them if you choose to be, is what she said. So I'm excited for your book to be one of those thousands of answers.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, I feel really honored. You're both so brilliant. Thank you for having me.
We love you.
Thank you.
Well, listen, that is our episode. Check out Are Prisons Obsolete by Angela Davis, Beyond Policing by Philip McHarris. And you can also follow local abolitionist groups online, folks like @question.culture, Critical Resistance, and Movement for Black Lives. Until next time, keep reimagining the future. You can find me on Instagram, Threads, and TikTok @FreckedWhileBlack. And my good sis, Jamira Burley, is @Jamira Burley on all platforms. See you on the other side.